At Campbell University Divinity School, we are passionate about our mission to be Christ-centered, Bible-based, and ministry-focused. In this installment of Conversations at Campbell, we are considering the case for being Christ-centered, giving thought to why it matters that being Christ-centered is our starting place. Today I'm joined by Dr. Cameron Jorgenson, Associate Professor of Christian Theology and Ethics at Campbell Divinity School, and the Program Director for the Master of Arts in Faith and Leadership Formation, for a conversation with students, alumni, and members of our community. Welcome to Conversations at Campbell, thoughtful explorations of faith and real life. Welcome to Conversations at Campbell, thoughtful explorations of faith and real life. My name is Barry Jones, and I'm Professor of Old Testament and Hebrew. One of the things I enjoy greatly about a Divinity School campus is we have the opportunity and there is a space and community for discussing matters that are central and important. And we've gathered a community here today. So welcome to you, students and alumni and members of our community, for being a part of this conversation. I'm here with Dr. Cameron Jorgenson. He's Associate Professor of Christian Theology and Ethics. And our topic today is the case for being Christ-centered. So we'll go ahead and get into our conversation. Fantastic. Like you, I've always enjoyed the mission statement of Campbell University and have found it inspiring. But I have talked to some people who say, a Christ-centered divinity school sounds like a blinding glimpse of the obvious. Wouldn't any Christian divinity school be Christ-centered? So would you maybe give us some of your best reasons for why it's good to be intentional about making this a part of the mission?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I would say that it should be blindingly obvious, and there is some usefulness in stating what is most obvious to get our first principles firmly established. And so starting there just makes sense in terms of identifying who we are and what matters most, but there's more to it than that. It's aspirational, right? I mean, as soon as we name something like Christ-centeredness as the first plank of what matters most to us, we are setting the bar awfully high. We are establishing for ourselves a standard we will never fully reach. And I think that's why it's worth stating at the outset. We need this as an aspirational goal and as a way of checking ourselves. Are we still? Because there are a lot of other goods that are part of what it means to be a divinity school. Academic excellence, that's a good thing. We believe in that here. Even justice, we want to pursue justice and raise up ministers who are committed to that cause. Even innovation, excellence in ministry to meet a new day. All of those things are good things. But if you allow any of those things to be the center, then it takes an outsized role, a misshapen role. You think about the old definition of what a heresy is. It's a grain of truth. It's a good idea that's been taken all out of proportion and maybe exalted to a level that it should not be. For instance, we would say Jesus Christ is fully human and fully divine, but if you elevate either side of that equation to the exclusion of the other, it's no longer truth. So when we say that we are Christ-centered, we are starting out by setting for ourselves an ambitious goal and a way of checking to make sure that none of the other goods that we care about in this place have overtaken the ultimate good.
Thank you. That's very helpful. If we don't name the center, then something else can move into that center which may not be able to sustain that weight. That's a helpful way of describing it. Christ-centered, it's two words. A lot of people find those words to be inspiring, but it may need some fleshing out. Can you tell me what that ought to look like in a divinity school community or in a Christian community?
Yeah. Especially in the context of the divinity school. I think of it in terms of spiritual formation. So when we are talking to prospective students and explaining the mission statement to them, I like to say Christ-centered, Bible-based, ministry-focused loosely maps onto spiritual formation, intellectual formation, and ministerial preparation. And those three things are awfully important. So the spiritual formation piece, I think it's important to have that first and foremost, because if all we are doing is filling heads and creating competent technicians to operate in the church, but they're not being spiritually formed, that cannot sustain a life of ministry. They need to be formed. Yeah, I need to be formed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's very well said and very important.
Well, I'm curious, how would you answer that question?
What does Christ-centered mean to me? Yeah, thank you for that question. To me, it's very important because we are in a graduate school and our focus is on knowledge, but the most essential knowledge for being a minister and for living a Christian life is knowledge of God. And it's a different kind of knowledge. It's personal. It's experiential, and it's relational. So while I may be a so-called expert in my field, when it comes to the knowledge of God, that's a constant pursuit. Yeah. And I have ups and downs in that pursuit. So to have a community that continually calls me back to making knowledge of God through the person of Jesus Christ the central focus for me is something that I just deeply appreciate, and it allows me to thrive in my spiritual life.
Yeah, it's a good word. It's good.
Recently, I was listening to an interview by an author who had written a book on practicing the Sabbath and restoring Sabbath practice. And she said very forthrightly, the first thing you need to know is that if you want to keep the Sabbath, you cannot do it by yourself. You have to be in a community that sustains that practice. How does a community fit into your understanding of being Christ-centered?
First of all, that is such a brilliant insight. It makes me think of when we have gone as a divinity school over to Israel, and I think about how much easier, in a certain sense, it would be to practice Sabbath in Israel, where as a community, these things are working that way. So the light switches don't work on the Sabbath. The elevators are not running. There's this kind of reinforcement of an ideal by way of communal practices, communal standards. And so if I'm thinking about Christ-centeredness, I think the same thing is true there too, because if it comes down to practices and it comes down to habits of mind, if you're the only one trying to do this, it's not going to happen. It's like a family. If you're trying to change your eating habits, everybody's going to get on board. Because if one person's having pecan pie, I'm having pecan pie too.
Count me in.
Yes.
Here's a question that leans into your vocation as a theologian who helps Christians think about deep questions. Is there a difference between being Christ-centered or being God-centered? Mm-hmm. And why is it important to say Christ-centered?
Yeah. I don't think they absolutely have to be mutually exclusive. But there are certain theologians that have attempted to carve out space for, or at least to make a strong claim in favor of being theocentric instead of Christocentric, along the lines of what you've just said. One of those is James Gustafson, who wrote a book called Theocentric Ethics. And his idea, I think, and I'm sympathetic to a degree, what he wants to say is, you know, if we're going to do ethics and we're going to do it across traditions, and not everybody can get on board with, you know, the Jesus part, you know, when that is precisely the point of contention, if the only thing you can bring to the table is a claim made by Jesus, then it's hard to rally common support across traditions, you know. So if you think about the Abrahamic faiths, Muslims and Christians and Jews together doing moral reasoning, if we foreground our distinctly Christian convictions about who Jesus is, might that be a stumbling block or a non-starter? So I'm sympathetic as far as that goes. There is a risk, though, I think, in that theocentric move. And the idea, I think, is the risk is that we might check our deepest convictions at the door and search for a lowest common denominator and maybe ignore those things we hold most passionately for the sake of avoiding disagreement. And I don't think that's healthy. There's a political philosopher, Michael Walzer, who I think is really interesting. He wrote a book called Thick and Thin. And in it, he talks about thick descriptions, thick communities. And that's that business of taking your full self, your deepest convictions, all the stuff, the thick description of why you believe what you believe, bringing that to the conversation, and then seeking the points of continuity, the points of agreement with folks across traditions, as opposed to entering it kind of sort of pretending that at the end of the day we all believe the same things, which we don't. So to me, a Christocentric position is more honest, first of all, but it's also more fruitful, because if we bring to the story a thinned out conviction that says, well, we all believe in love. Love is good. You like love. I like love. Love is love. If we do that, then we miss the richness of what we can say as Christians. Greater love has no one than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends. In other words, there's a very particular story that shapes how we understand love. And that doesn't mean that everybody else in the room has to be in perfect agreement with that, but at least we can have that story as a starting place, as a thing that we can share and ponder together, just as we would ponder their stories, their terminology. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so the content of the life and the teachings of Jesus as a person and as a human being who is also in the mystery of God, fully God, has a content that's just hard to describe without that story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most important things about what Christianity is. It's not just a big idea. It's not just a philosophical system. It is a truth claim based on a story. The Word becomes flesh, dwells among us, and we say that that's how God makes God's self known. And so if we bracket out the Jesus part, it's hard to know what is left.
Right. I read a quote by Eugene Peterson a few years ago that talked about Jesus' statement, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And he said one of the criticisms of Christians is that we settle for 2 out of 3. That we, like to recognize Jesus as the truth and the life, but not always the way. That we can claim the name of Jesus and follow ways that aren't like the way of Jesus. So how does being Christ-centered shape us in terms of our character and the way that we carry out our mission in the world?
I guess one piece that we could say in response to that would be that the way of Christ is, or at least the way of a follower of Christ, is one that's inherently responsive. It's not about pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It's not about just harnessing enough willpower or our own initiative. It is a response to a divine invitation. And I think that's a pretty powerful starting place for what the way looks like. It's a way of following. It's a way of even obedience. These are words that we don't particularly like because we like to have things on our own terms. But I think so far as we insist on our own way, we have a hard time following Christ's way. Yes. And that requires a certain amount of death to self. Oh
yeah, that's certainly true. And there's grace in the responsiveness that God has acted first in the person of Jesus, and then we are called to respond to what God has graciously done.
Yeah, grace in a lot of ways, including grace when we get it wrong, or grace when we are not following perfectly, grace when we utterly miss the point. That's, to me, one of the really encouraging parts of the gospel, that I think especially of the Gospel of Mark, where over and over and over, the disciples following Jesus are saying, who is this? And if anybody had a front row seat to who this is, if anybody should have gotten it, it should have been them. And yet Jesus is patiently revealing, patiently working to bring them along. And I think Jesus does that for us too.
Yeah, that's a great word. We do have a question from our audience, and so I would call on Charles Royal to share his question.
Sure. I recently heard a speaker observe that cross-country skiers best avoid the trees and other obstacles by focusing on the path, the way through. He observed that when they focus on avoiding the obstacles, their skiing is more erratic, and the odds go up that they'll hit some obstacles. Do you think Christian leaders and influencers carelessly advocate for avoiding obstacles, thus bringing attention to focus to the obstacles and often failing to encourage folks just to follow the path of Christ? I wonder if it has something to do with fear. Does fear garner more support and attention?
Ooh. Sure. From a communications perspective, you bet. If you want eyeballs or ears listening, you stoke some fear. So yeah, that is true. Does it work to keep people from hitting the trees? No, generally not. I love your question because it touches on material that's near and dear to my heart. One of my favorite classes to teach is called Virtues and Vices, where we spend roughly half the semester looking at the 7 deadly sins and the other half looking at the vices. The virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues. And it's interesting. We always start with the vices, and I like to start there primarily because we know them so much better than we know the virtues, right? Experientially, we have lots of data to work with. And it's interesting, over the years of teaching this, I've come to a bit of a conviction about this, and that is that if we pay too much attention to the vices, we're going to have a hard time avoiding them, mainly because studying the vices in great detail, it's kind of like being given a book about a landmine. You're getting great detail about how this thing works, how this thing can blow you up. And you say, ooh, I don't want to step on that. But it doesn't necessarily, as a book about landmines, tell you where they're planted in that field standing in front of you. What you need, of course, is a map. And a description of a landmine does not necessarily give you a map about how to avoid it, right? And that, to me, is the value of the virtues. The virtues show you the path forward. It shows you the way. But as we've been thinking about all this business of Christ-centered, the metaphor has shifted for me a little bit. I've been thinking about this whole business of map for a while. But how much better if you're not only using a map to navigate that minefield? What if instead you have a trusted guide? You're following somebody who knows where those landmines are so they can weave for you. I would take that any day over my interpretation of a map that I may or may not read all that well. Yeah, so I agree. By the way, is it still helpful, though, to have the book about the landmines? Sure. Just like, is it helpful to have, say, the DSM-5, to have a really good description of what psychological pathologies look like, how, disturbances of the soul, what they look like. It's helpful to have a deep dive because you may have to do some troubleshooting along the way. You might come upon one that needs to be diffused. It's helpful to have the book. But still, we need the guide. We need the map. And that's more trustworthy. That's where the focus should be. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I love that image of having a personal guide and the understanding of our companionship with Jesus as a guide to our growth. In your message today, you talked about Jesus, the scriptural witness of being Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. So also as in the goal of the Christian life. How does being Christ-centered help us to have a better evaluation of how we're progressing toward the goal of Christ?
Yeah, the field of virtue ethics generally talks about the telos. What is the end for which you are striving? What does the good life look like? What does it mean to be a fully flourishing human being? And in the Christian tradition, well, we have a pretty ready answer for that. We'd say it's Jesus, it's the Word made flesh. So in that sense, we've got a really helpful telos already in place that helps us to say, to what degree am I progressing toward my true end? To what degree am I looking more and more like Christ? There's that. But the other piece of it, the arche piece of it, is the one that I don't think we pay nearly enough attention to. I don't think I've not encountered it being emphasized much in contemporary virtue ethics. But for Christians, I think this is incredibly important because it helps to establish our understanding of who we are in the first place, that we are created both good and yet we are fallen. I like Paul Tillich's word on this, that we are essentially good and yet existentially estranged. And when he says essentially good, he doesn't mean, more or less good. He means essentially, in our very essence. And why? It's because Christ is our arche. Christ is our source. He's the one who gives us being. And so out of this we have been called. And so therefore we are God's very good creation. And yet our experience of life is one of estrangement. It's one of brokenness and estrangement from others, from God, even from ourselves, which we see play out in the garden, right? In Genesis 3, where you see that interruption of relatedness between the humans and between the humans and God and between the humans and creation, between themselves. They're wearing fig leaves, right? And that's a whole lot of existential estrangement. That's a great distance from the telos. And yet, we are reminded from the beginning, we are God's very good, beloved creation. And we can't lose sight of that.
Wow. Yeah, that is a very helpful word. We are part of a much bigger story.
Yes.
That doesn't begin with us.
Yep.
And there's a lot of grace in that too.
Yes.
You and I are academics, and I define an academic as a person whose hobby is reading books about other people's hobbies. So I think it's good to ask you, what would be a book you would recommend to us to learn more about growing in being Christ-centered?
I suppose if I had to only choose one, I would maybe commend the one that probably was most responsible for starting me on this kind of journey of maybe at least an attempted Christocentric spirituality, right? The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. And the whole point, if you haven't read the book, the whole point of that book is about trying to live into that call to pray without ceasing, and sort of his spiritual counsel about how to do this, even as he works in the kitchen at the monastery, which he doesn't particularly like, but he's even using these daily difficult sacrifices to even mundane tasks to free up the mind to just pray without ceasing. And I think that's pretty wonderful, because prayer, to me, the best definition I've ever encountered was the philosopher Simone Weil, who described prayer as attention directed toward God. And I think being Christ-centered has everything to do with making sure that the attention of our heart, the direction of our heart, is pointed again and again toward Christ, and calling ourselves to lift up our hearts in that direction. Yeah.
Well, I love that answer because it anticipated my next question, which is to get us out of our cognitive bias as academics and think about practice, and what are some of the sustaining practices that help us to realize the mission of being Christ-centered.
Sure. So how about I give some practices combined with a book each or two.
I'm good with that.
So if you're looking for a reading list, I can help you with that. One is this. I mentioned this in passing in the sermon, but I am convinced that theology at its best is essentially an act of mind and spirit. It is essentially prayer. It's the attention of a heart directed toward God. It's a form of prayer when it's done well. And as a result, I think one example of this would be the trilogy of books written by Benedict XVI, the recently deceased Benedict XVI, who wrote a book, Jesus of Nazareth, and he breaks the life of Christ into 3 sections. And it's remarkable, mainly because here is a theologian who is engaging biblical studies. How about that? That's pretty exciting. Cross-disciplinary. But in addition to theology and biblical studies, it is also deeply connected to spiritual theology. It's deeply connected to questions of where we find the depth of significance in these texts. So it's not just reconstructing a life of Christ, but it's trying to peer into the mystery of what was revealed. So I love that trilogy of books. So that'd be one way to kind of redeem, say, maybe the intellectual thing, and to make our intellectual work part of our practice, right, instead of just seeing that as a separate thing. So there's that. I also mentioned in the sermon the practice of the Stations of the Cross, something that I've long been fascinated by. If anyone's interested in the biblical Stations of the Cross, Amy Wellborn is an author who has reflected on John Paul II's biblical way of the cross. So that's her book. What's significant about that is the way of the cross over time had been based on pilgrimage routes through the Holy Land. And it was based on traditional sites where they say Jesus carried the cross or Jesus fell. You have 3 different falls of Christ along the way, not mentioned in Scripture. But in 1991, John Paul issues a scriptural Stations of the Cross, which are all based on little vignettes through the Passion narrative. So especially for Protestants, it's a really helpful way to engage an ancient practice. So I like that. Can I give you one more? Is that all right?
Sure.
I think learning to engage with our eyes is important because if you think about the Word made flesh dwelling among us, that's 3-dimensional, right? Could we make any graven images of God? No. The 10 Commandments say do not. And yet Colossians 1 says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In other words, God images himself in Christ. So there's this whole tradition in the church of imaging Jesus as a way of carrying on God's self-imaging in Christ. And I find that so compelling. So iconography has been a really helpful tool for me to really sit with Christ. There are some really good books. Rowan Williams has written a couple of them that are awfully good. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, really good stuff. One is Ponder These Things. That's a really good one. Also, The Dwelling of the Light. It's a pair of fantastic books about that. Maybe one more. Can I give you one more? And this is not a book, but this is a way that we can live into these things. And that's developing the theological habit of mind of looking at the whole world as text. So this semester I'm teaching a course on theology and culture. And the whole point of that class is so that we can gain the skills of paying attention to the world around us as theological texts, whether we're talking about the arts, film, music, literature, or whether we're talking about just even current events, learning to discern the times, to engage them, to take them seriously as things that have something to say about God. So there's that. And then also I teach a course on theology and food. And the reason why I do that is because I think it's so important to attempt to encounter God in the everyday, because Christ is ever in the highways and the byways making God known. And so even if we're stirring a bowl of pancake batter, Christ can be found there too.
Wonderful. Those are wonderful recommendations, and this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. I've greatly enjoyed it, and thank you to our audience for being a part of this conversation. And stay tuned for more information and more resources that you'll see on our website. Thank you all very much. Thanks for joining us for Conversations at Campbell. We would love for you to join the conversation as well. Please subscribe to the channel to be notified of future episodes. Even better, you can join us on campus live for the next event. We'll even buy you lunch. Check out the video description for links to upcoming conversations and additional resources related to today's discussion, like readings, study guides, and other great content. Until next time.